October 1942. The desert around El Alamein was already smoking when the last Italian M1340 and M1441 tanks backed through the dunes, their engines choking in the heat. For many crews of the Ariete and Littorio armored divisions, the battle that British and Commonwealth troops called the Second Battle of El Alamein was not just another defeat, it was the collapse of a belief system. They had entered North Africa under banners that promised efficiency, destiny, and modernity. Instead, they found their diesel engines seizing in sand, while Shermans and Crusaders advanced with radios crackling and supply trucks rolling behind. By the first week of November, Axis lines were breaking everywhere. The desert sky shimmered with artillery dust. Italian tankers abandoned vehicles whose tracks had snapped or whose guns had jammed after hours of overuse. Columns of prisoners began forming almost immediately, men stumbling from positions once thought impregnable. When British patrols gathered them under the white glare of flares, the captured soldiers were offered water before questions. It was a small gesture, but one that contrasted sharply with everything fascist propaganda had described about the enemy. Within days, the first groups were herded into makeshift pens near Mersa Matra and Tobruk. The British treated them efficiently: registration, medical checks, field rations, then the long march to the ports. For many, this march through the desert was more punishing than combat. Dust coated every pore, and the humiliation of defeat pressed heavier than the heat. Yet even here, something unexpected surfaced: discipline among guards, organized logistics, and food supplies that seemed endless compared with the shortages Italian units had suffered for months. In early 1943, after Tunisia fell, the stream of prisoners became a flood. More than 100,000 Italians, captured alongside their German comrades, were processed through Allied staging areas. Rumors spread quickly through the barbed wire compounds. They were being shipped to the United States. At first, few believed it. America was a distant abstraction, a name associated with Hollywood, industrial smoke, and the endless tanks that had overrun them. The idea that ordinary Italian soldiers would see it with their own eyes sounded impossible. The transfer began quietly. Trucks carried them to Bizerte and Iran, where Liberty ships waited under camouflage netting. British officers explained that the Geneva Convention guaranteed their safety and that the ocean voyage would be secure. Each man received a numbered tag, a new uniform marked PW, and vaccinations before boarding. Many expected cramped holds and starvation. Instead, they found bunks, clean galley food, and medical orderlies handing out seasickness tablets. For men who had lived on tinned meat and dust, the smell of baked bread from the ship's galley was almost unreal. As the convoy slipped westward, the captured tankers stood on deck at night, watching the Atlantic convoy lights stretching to the horizon, dozens of cargo vessels escorted by destroyers. The scene hinted at an industrial world far larger than anything they had imagined. They had fought a war of scarcity. Now they were being carried across an ocean of abundance. Ahead lay a nation they had been told was decadent and weak. Within weeks, they would see for themselves what power had truly defeated them. The ocean was calm most days. The Liberty ships moved in long lines, each keeping its distance, engines thudding like heartbeats in the night. The Italian prisoners, still in disbelief, leaned over the rails to feel the cold spray of the Atlantic. For men who had spent months breathing desert dust, the air tasted new, salted, sharp, and endless. Life aboard those American-built ships was simple, but it revealed something that no speech could have explained. The ships were clean. Meals came on time. The crew worked with quiet precision. There was order, but not fear. No shouting officers, no propaganda slogans painted on bulkheads, just men doing their jobs efficiently. Even the food shocked the prisoners. Thick slices of white bread, coffee every morning, meat served daily. Some could not finish their meals. They tried to save leftovers until guards explained they could ask for more at any time. To soldiers who had fought half-starved in North Africa, it felt impossible. After 2 weeks at sea, the convoys entered the Chesapeake Bay. Dawn revealed something they had never imagined: an industrial landscape that stretched for miles. Norfolk Naval Base, cranes swung like metal giants above the docks. Trains clattered in the background, cargo ships loaded and unloaded at every pier. Electric lights burned even though it was daytime. One Italian officer whispered to another, "Even in Rome, we don't have this many cranes." As the ships docked, bands of American sailors and longshoremen worked side by side without chaos. Nobody shouted, nobody panicked. Everything moved with the rhythm of a well-rehearsed machine. The prisoners were told to gather their bags. Trucks waited to take them to waiting trains. Here they saw lines of new vehicles: jeeps, ambulances, and tractors, all painted in olive drab, all brand new. Every vehicle had a number. Every crate had a destination tag. Logistics, not speeches, ruled here. When they boarded the trains, more surprises came. The cars were clean with padded seats and windows. Guards handed out boxed lunches, sandwiches, fruit, and small cartons of milk. As the train rolled through Virginia and into the Carolinas, prisoners pressed their faces to the glass. Outside were towns glowing with electric lights. Every house had a car parked nearby. Every shop window was filled with goods. Factories worked through the night. The landscape looked alive in a way wartime Europe no longer did. Letters written later from these men describe the same moment of realization. The United States was not rich by accident. It was rich because millions of ordinary people could work freely and efficiently without fear. Their propaganda had called democracy weak. Yet here, democracy had built an empire of production that stretched from coast to coast. By the time the trains crossed into Tennessee and Texas, the prisoners had seen more electric light, more cars, and more food than Italy had in its largest cities. They began to understand a truth that no general could explain. They had not lost to better soldiers. They had lost to a system that made strength ordinary. The trains finally stopped at fenced compounds that stretched over flat American land. Wooden watchtowers stood at each corner, but the first thing the Italians noticed was not the guards, it was the space. Rows of wooden barracks stood clean and evenly built, surrounded by fields of grass. Signs marked Camp Hereford, Camp McAllister, and Camp Oplica. These names would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When the gates opened, the prisoners expected harsh orders, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, they found order, warmth, and routine. Each barrack had electric light, running water, and wooden bunks with clean blankets. There were canteens, washrooms, and even small libraries filled with donated books. In the center of the camp, an American flag moved in the wind, and a loudspeaker played soft radio music during mealtimes. It was strange. It felt less like punishment and more like being inside a small, perfectly organized town. Every morning began with roll call, then breakfast, eggs, toast, milk, sometimes oatmeal. Many prisoners couldn't believe the variety of food. Some thought it was a trick meant to change their loyalty. But after weeks passed, they realized it was simply how the Americans treated their prisoners. The Geneva Convention was followed to the letter. There were hospitals inside the camps, with doctors who treated Italians and Germans using the same medicine as American soldiers. Wounded tank crewmen burned or crippled from desert battles were given surgeries and penicillin, a drug they had never seen before. For some, it meant survival that would have been impossible back home. In letters home, censored but still heartfelt, they wrote about the strange kindness of the guards. They described how Americans separated the fascists from the rest, but never with cruelty. "They fight Mussolini, not us," one wrote. "They feed us better than our officers did." Daily life followed a calm rhythm. Work details repaired camp buildings, baked bread, and tended vegetable gardens. Others joined small orchestras or soccer teams. The Americans encouraged them to make art, to learn, to use time usefully. Camp newspapers printed in Italian shared stories about world news, often showing photographs of battlefields or factories. The prisoners discussed them late into the night, trying to understand how this enemy nation could be so powerful yet so casual in its abundance. Over time, fear gave way to curiosity. Guards sometimes played baseball and invited prisoners to watch. On holidays, they shared coffee or small gifts. These gestures cut deep. The Italians had been told Americans were greedy, godless, and cruel. Yet the men they saw were polite, generous, and confident without arrogance. By the end of 1943, something quiet but irreversible had started. Thousands of Italian soldiers no longer believed in the slogans they had been taught. They began to see that strength did not have to come from control or fear. It could come from fairness, order, and respect, values they were living under as captives. By mid-1943, America faced a labor shortage. Millions of young men were fighting overseas, and farms needed workers. So the War Department allowed Italian prisoners to volunteer for agricultural and industrial jobs that did not directly support combat. They earned small wages in camp coupons, enough to buy tobacco, soap, or extra treats at the canteen. What seemed like ordinary labor soon became another lesson in how different this nation truly was. The first time Italian POWs walked into American farmland, they were stunned by the size. Wheat fields stretched farther than the eye could see. Machines the size of houses rolled across the soil, combined harvesters cutting, thrashing, and sorting grain all at once. One machine did the work of 100 men. Farmers joked, "This is what wins wars," and they were not wrong. The prisoners had grown up in villages where oxen still pulled plows. Here, even small farms had tractors, trucks, and electric pumps drawing water from deep wells. In Nebraska and Kansas, the Italians worked during harvest season. At first, they tried to use their old habits, slow, careful handwork. But American farmers showed them how to operate modern equipment. Many were shocked that the farmers treated them with patience, even friendship. They shared lunches under the shade of barns, drinking cold milk from bottles. The POWs couldn't believe that ordinary rural workers ate meat every day and owned cars parked by their barns. Later, some were assigned to cotton gins and canneries in Texas and New Jersey. Their machines replaced entire crews of laborers. Conveyor belts hummed. Women operated controls that managed what would have taken dozens of people in Italy. At the Campbell soup plant, one old soldier wrote, "A woman here does the work of 50 men and she listens to the radio while doing it." The factory smelled of tomatoes and steel, a scent that meant productivity and efficiency. Others worked in military supply depots. They unloaded crates of spare parts, tools, and engines. Trains arrived every day, perfectly scheduled. Every item had a number, a label, a destination. Nothing was wasted. It was logistics on a scale they had never imagined. They began to understand how the Allies could fight across continents without running out of fuel or ammunition. The system itself was the real weapon. Evenings back in camp, they talked about what they had seen. "They don't fear the boss," one man said. "They respect the job." For the first time, they realized that democracy didn't mean disorder. It meant shared responsibility. Every worker, from farmer to machinist, believed his effort mattered. That belief powered the endless ships, planes, and tanks they had faced in the desert. By winter, those who once cursed the American war machine began to admire it, not for its violence, but for its precision and fairness. They were learning, slowly and deeply, that freedom could build discipline more effectively than dictatorship ever could. As 1944 arrived, the camps grew quieter but more thoughtful. The Americans had realized that education was more powerful than punishment. University professors, chaplains, and army officers began offering lectures to the prisoners, lessons about democracy, economics, and freedom of speech. For men raised under fascist slogans, it was the first time they heard opposing ideas explained calmly instead of shouted through loudspeakers. They learned that in America, a worker could question his boss, a newspaper could criticize the president, and people still worked together. To most Italians, that balance between freedom and order felt impossible, yet here it was, functioning every day around them. In the recreation halls, weekly movie nights showed American newsreels. When the D-Day invasion began in June 1944, prisoners watched black and white footage only days later. They saw thousands of ships crossing the channel, lines of tanks rolling through French towns, endless planes overhead. The narrator's calm voice described the largest invasion in history. Many prisoners sat silent afterward. They understood what those images meant. This nation could move armies like a single body because its factories, farms, and people worked in perfect rhythm. Some prisoners took correspondence courses from American universities. Others studied English or learned mechanical trades. Camp newspapers began printing discussions about post-war Italy, what kind of country it should become once fascism was gone. For the first time, men who had once repeated party slogans started debating ideas like free elections, trade unions, and civil rights. Even the most skeptical soldiers began to see connections between what they learned and what they observed. They compared Italy's wartime production, a few thousand tanks, with America's tens of thousands every year. They talked about wages, hours, and working conditions. How could a nation that allowed strikes and criticism still produce so much? The answer came from what they saw daily: motivated workers, confident leadership, and respect for individual skill. The system trusted people, and in return, people gave their best. When Allied victories filled the newspapers, the prisoners were no longer angry. Many even felt relief. The end of fascism now seemed like an opportunity, not humiliation. Letters home changed tone. They spoke of rebuilding, of modern farming, of education for all. Some wrote that Italy could learn more from America in peace than it ever had from Germany in war. By late 1944, over 90% of Italian prisoners volunteered to join Allied service units, helping in ports, hospitals, and rail depots. They wore U.S. uniforms marked Italy, carried tools instead of rifles, and worked beside American soldiers. They were no longer enemies, they were students of a new way of life. Each lecture, film, and newspaper page made the same point without preaching. Real power came from knowledge and cooperation. The men who had once fought for fascism were quietly becoming believers in democracy, not from persuasion, but from proof they could see with their own eyes. By spring 1945, the war was ending. News of Germany's collapse and Mussolini's death reached the camps through radios and newspapers. The Italian prisoners gathered quietly around bulletin boards, reading headlines that confirmed what many had already accepted. The old world was gone. Fascism had promised glory and delivered ruin. America, the supposed decadent democracy, had conquered by production, by unity, and by faith in ordinary people. Repatriation began soon after victory. Men who had spent 2 or 3 years in the United States packed their belongings into small duffel bags. They boarded trains again, this time headed east, and ships that crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction. The voyage home was filled with mixed feelings. They longed to see their families, but many wondered if they were leaving behind something greater than comfort, an idea of how society could work when it trusted its citizens. When they landed in Italy, the shock was immediate. The ports were broken, cities bombed, railways shattered. Electricity was unreliable, food scarce, and factories silent. It felt like stepping backward in time. Yet among the returning prisoners, a new determination had formed. They had seen a working model of democracy, and they wanted to rebuild their homeland with the same spirit. Some went back to farms and introduced the methods they had learned in Nebraska and Kansas: better irrigation, mechanical tools, and cooperative farming. Others returned to factories in Turin and Milan, where they pushed for fair wages, safer conditions, and modern assembly techniques modeled after the plants they had seen in America. A few even entered politics, supporting Italy's transition to a republic in 1946. Quietly, the lessons of captivity began to reshape the nation. Historians later called it the long echo of captivity. The men who had once fought under the black banners of fascism now defended the idea of free labor, education, and open debate. They had learned that democracy was not chaos, it was strength with respect. They had learned that freedom could produce not weakness, but endless creativity. The Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s grew partly from that seed, a generation of workers who had seen efficiency without oppression. They remembered the electric lights of Norfolk, the machines in the fields of Texas, and the steady hum of factories that never stopped. They carried those images home, not as humiliation, but as hope. In museums today, rusted M1340 tanks stand as relics of a failed dream. But the greater legacy lies in the men who once drove them. They entered the war believing power came from obedience. They left captivity believing it came from cooperation. The journey from desert defeat to democratic rebirth was not marked by guns, but by understanding. What they saw in America did more than change their faith. It helped rebuild their country and reshape Europe for generations.